Welcome to Inside the Mask, the podcast where we cover off all your favorite horror movies with a true crime twist. Today we'll be looking at something more unconventional for the true crime spin, and we'll be jumping into a 1982 remake that would become a sci-fi horror classic. It's the story of a remote group of researchers who, while working in an outpost in the desolate tundra of Antarctica, find themselves falling victim to some kind of mysterious infection. And while recovered journals and voice recordings can piece together some details of the case, the ultimate findings at the site in question are heavily debated. Did one of the Outpost crew simply snap, perhaps the result of the extreme isolation and no doubt cabin fever? Or do you believe the conspiracy theories that the origin of these mass killings and the virus within might be something extraterrestrial? I'm your host, Evan Taggart, and this is The Thing. It's the first week of winter in 1982, and in the remote regions of Antarctica, the temperatures are reaching near-record lows. And after losing communication with a U.S. research outpost, emergency authorities are dispatched to investigate the site and perform a wellness check on the crew manning the outpost itself. What they would find at Outpost 31 has puzzled experts and theorists for years, and famously, the investigation may provide more questions than it does answers. When investigators arrive at the facility, they discover it to be in complete disarray. The majority of Outpost 31 suffered from a series of massive explosions, resulting in extensive structural damage and subsequent freezing of the inside of what was left of the building. Initial photographic evidence shows that portions of the facility were, in fact, still burning when authorities later arrived days after the events in question. The cause of these explosions was eventually presumed to have been the result of a massive detonation of explosive materials, as these explosives were found to have been missing from the storage area of the outpost where they were typically secured for safety reasons. Structural damage was also discovered in the maintenance tunnels under the facility, but due to the extensive damage and the risk of potential collapse, these areas and tunnels could not actually be fully explored by authorities on the scene. Now, due to the well-known fact that there were no survivors of the murders or the viral outbreak, depending on what theories you believe, the following case study is based on the findings of the responding aide, as well as the various journals and reports recovered as evidence from Outpost 31 and its crew. Now, this includes numerous audio logs from station chief pilot and also potential murder suspect R.J. McCready. At the time of the supposed viral infection and the numerous murders that took place at the outpost, famously resulting in the deaths of almost the entire crew stationed there, the frigid winter months were just beginning. The crew in question were not due for a rotation until at least the spring, and as such, they were already in a lengthened period of isolation at the facility. Now, this isolation is often credited to the various behaviors that would follow amongst the crew themselves, including the mistrust of one another and the potentially violent outcomes of certain members of this crew. Now, the crew itself was made up of a well-established group of specialized individuals. There was Station Commander Gary, who was primarily in charge of the facility operations itself. Additional staff included Chief Medical Advisor Dr. Copper, also seasoned biologist Blair and his assistant biologist Fuchs, stationed lead mechanic Childs and his assistant mechanic Palmer, and communications technician Windows. Extended crew on site included surveyor and animal handler Clark, as well as meteorologist George Bennings, geophysicist and technician Norris, as well as Knowles, who served as the head cook of the compound, rounded out this crew manning the outpost. And lastly, and probably the most well-known of the Outpost 31 crew, there was R.J. McCready, who was a helicopter pilot stationed at the facility, and is suggested by many reports to be the primary suspect in the 1982 killings at the outpost itself. Now, at some point during the season, logs show that the outpost received an unwelcome and unplanned visit from another group of researchers. A helicopter registered to a Norwegian research outpost, Thule, was located by investigators on site at this U.S. Outpost 31, and crime scene photographs obtained show that the air vehicle had been completely destroyed. Damage to the craft is consistent with that of some kind of internal explosion, and shrapnel patterns on the hull of the craft indicate that the cause of damage may have been the result of some kind of handheld explosive. which possibly ignited other explosives that were kept on board the helicopter itself, including a recorded total of 15 cans of highly flammable kerosene. And after sifting through this wreckage, the charred remains of what's assumed to be one of the pilots is recovered. Now, investigators also managed to locate the other pilot's body, though his final resting place and cause of death raises some interesting questions. This Norwegian pilot was found not among the wreckage of the aforementioned helicopter, but rather in the storage area of U.S. Outpost 31. Now, his cause of death, according to autopsy, which was performed by Chief Medical Officer Dr. Copper, was confirmed to be the result of trauma sustained from small arms gunfire. Now, security logs recovered on site confirmed the shooter to be none other than Station Security Commander Gary, who allegedly fired his weapon in an act of self-defense. These records also detail that when the Norwegian helicopter landed on site, the occupants engaged in a hostile and unprovoked exchange of gunfire with the inhabitants of Outpost 31. Now, this included, and was also corroborated by medical journals of Dr. Copper, injuring resident George Bennings. He suffered a gunshot wound to his leg. This attack resulted in Commander Gary discharging his own weapon, returning fire, and ultimately killing the armed assailant in the process. Now, it's important to note here that there was actually another survivor of this altercation, who was not a member of the Outpost 31 crew. Only in this case, the survivor was not human. A full-grown canine, a husky to be exact, had seemingly been fleeing these Norwegian pursuers for unknown reasons, and when the dust, or more accurately the snow, settles, the inhabitants of Outpost 31 take the animal in as one of their own. And according to some reports and theories, it may have been a life-altering mistake, proving to be the potential catalyst to not only the viral infection that would ravage the outpost, but the numerous murders that would also take place over the course of the next few days. In the hours following the initial shooting at Outpost 31, communications expert Windows does make an attempt to reach other U.S. outposts in the continent, namely that of the closest neighboring McMurdo Station. Now, it's unclear at the time of the investigation if the equipment had possibly been sabotaged by suspect R.J. McCready, but either way, logs show that Windows was unsuccessful in his attempts to hail other outposts, as he attempted to report the incident that just took place and potentially request support. It's during this time, and after these failed attempts, that the station crew understandably launches their own inquiry into the Norwegian attackers, as well as their possible motivations for the attack in question. Now, documents recovered from the body of the Norwegian pilot indicate that they have their own outpost set up nearby, with a total of 8 personnel active in attending the outpost itself. Now, at this point, it's decided that due to the threat presented from these armed attackers, a wellness check should probably be performed at this nearby Norwegian camp, which maps and records show is only a short helicopter flight southwest of Outpost 31. McCready and Dr. Copper set out to find this nearby site to further investigate, surmising that Copper could potentially provide aid if it's required once they arrive. Now, a combination of both medical journals from Copper and audio recordings from McCready indicate that when they arrive at the Norwegian outpost, they find the entire structure has suffered from extensive damage. It's apparent that, at least in some parts of the facility, a series of fires and explosions have occurred, compromising the structural integrity of the building. And in combination of the external temperatures in the environment reaching sub-zero degrees, the majority of the outpost has been completely frozen over, a similar state that would befall Outpost 31 in the next few days. In spite of the fact that the outpost had a registered crew count of 8 individuals, McCready and Copper's records indicate that they only actually located 2 bodies on site, both of which were transported back to Outpost 31 for autopsy. One of these victims is an unnamed crew member, who medical reports suggest may have died by suicide, though the eventual autopsy report from Copper showcases nothing out of the ordinary here. Now, the second unnamed body is located outside a nearby workshop, in a burnt-out pyre surrounded by kerosene. Only this time, as subsequent medical reports would show, these charred remains were anything but ordinary. Initial reports from the outbreak at Outpost 31 did include crime scene photographs of these remains, which were not only disturbing, but truly bizarre. The body itself seems to show signs of severe deformity, including multiple appendages and, potentially as surreal as it sounds, even multiple heads. Now, some experts suggest that this might have actually been the result of multiple persons being burned or disposed of in the same pyre, of which temperatures would have reached extreme highs, resulting in potentially some malformed amalgamation of the dead bodies. But when combined with the later reports of the infectious outbreak at Outpost 31, which we'll get into detail shortly, it does raise some questions about what may have actually happened at this nearby Norwegian outpost, and whether or not the events may have actually been similar to the subsequent events at the US outpost itself. Now, Chief Biology expert Blair is tasked with performing an extensive autopsy on the subject. However, Blair's autopsy of this malformed humanoid's remains reports that other than the obvious external complications and deformations, the internal organs of the body are actually completely normal and healthy, and they offer no clues as to the victim's actual cause of death. Now, shortly thereafter, another autopsy would take place, a result of a truly alarming series of events that would culminate in a perplexing and disturbing discovery. Later on in the evening at Outpost 31, as various crew members are sleeping in their quarters, a station-wide alarm is triggered, later confirmed to be at the hands of R.J. McCready. The crew apparently reported to the on-site kennel, where dog handler Clark kept and maintained numerous husky breed dogs, just in case of a mechanical failure of the various transportation vehicles of the outpost. Now, witness reports from both McCready's own logs as well as medical records indicate that the dog that they'd taken in, the same animal from the Norwegian outpost, may have actually suffered from some sort of viral infection or disease, resulting in some sort of a potential genetic mutation of the animal itself. Now, reports here are a bit unclear, but it seems as though that during a potential cross-contamination of the other animals on site, this Norwegian husky was ultimately terminated by a combination of gunfire from R.J. McCready and the use of a weaponized flamethrower unit from lead mechanic Childs. Now, these events are confirmed by responding forensic testing in the kennel itself, where mass amounts of canine blood was discovered, as well as the frozen remains of other dogs found to have been euthanized. Now, this may have, in fact, been the first time that the crew of Outpost 31 was exposed to this supposed viral infection that would ravage the location over the next few days, causing heightened tensions and paranoia among the residents themselves. You gotta think it's one thing to be locked away for the winter with a group of people for a serious length of time, and it's another when people start becoming sick and maybe they don't present any kind of symptoms immediately. Examination of the malformed remains of the animal are once again performed by Blair, and the results of this particular autopsy are seemingly medically impossible. Blair's reports show that there was DNA present from not only the canine species, but potentially and somehow other species as well, including what seemed to be from some form of arachnid and potentially even human DNA. Additionally, it appears that this biological form inspected shows signs of multiple organisms within, such as duplicated extremities and internal organs. Now, it's important to acknowledge that many agree that these medical reports are quite possibly exaggerated or potentially even completely fabricated. It's a well-known fact that biologist Blair would eventually slip into what's deemed to be an isolation-induced mania at Outpost 31, and as such, many of his reports are considered suspect. In addition, as we'll discuss later, it's quite possible that murder suspect R.J. McCready may have completely fabricated all of these reports to cover up his own crimes at the base itself. But whether you believe the conspiracy theories or not, the autopsy performed on the expired canine from the Norwegian camp is no doubt considered a medical phenomenon. At this point, the crew of Outpost 31 is understandably shaken. The events of the last 24 hours have been nothing short of unprecedented, and the majority want answers as to what exactly they might be dealing with here. Now, the team bands together to further research their only known lead, the tragic happenings at the nearby Norwegian research facility. At the time of McCready and Copper's initial investigation at the camp, they actually recovered an intact video recording device, later taken in as evidence by responding authorities investigating the disturbance at Outpost 31. And after sifting through near 9 hours of footage, investigators confirmed the Outpost crew's own findings of this footage. It would appear that the Norwegian team had discovered something long buried in the ancient tundra of Antarctica. And if reports are to be believed, it may have been biological, and may have also been extraterrestrial in origin. Now, pressing pause here, there's actually no real connection confirming that these findings were alien whatsoever. The facts of the case are that both video footage and supposed on-site surveillance of this Norwegian dig site showcase what appears to be a massive crater in the ice. But experts and government officials seem to suggest that this might actually be nothing more than an impact crater from a meteorite, or perhaps even a massive structural collapse caused by thermite explosives that were found to have been set by the Norwegian crew. However, some theorists suggest that the footage may showcase some sort of structure within this crater itself, the sheer size of which suggests something that might not actually be man-made. But again, due to the fact that no actual photographs of this supposed UFO exist, and yes, that's what most conspiracy theorists suggest, it's a UFO, this theory here is probably best taken with a grain of salt. The happenings of the Outpost 31 tragedy also have a much more practical explanation, one of which happens to be not of extraterrestrial origin, but rather something biological. One of the theories regarding the mass deaths at Outpost 31 point to the research documents of Chief Biologist Blair. It's theorized that some sort of biological infection of unknown origin may have impacted not only the inhabitants of the US outpost, but also the departed crew of the Norwegian outpost as well. Now, these theories point to the explosive devices that the Norwegian research team was found to have used in their exploration of the frozen tundra, and that in doing so, they may have actually unwittingly exposed themselves to a long-dormant invasive virus or parasitic infection in the process. And given the autopsy results of the canine from the Norwegian camp itself, that virus may have actually spread to the US Outpost 31. Now, Blair kept extensive reports of his own findings in the supposed viral outbreak, including the now dated computer predictions of infection rates of the virus in question. Recovered computer records show that it was estimated at the time, if this outbreak was not contained, the potential of worldwide infection would be in a period of less than 3 years. And even further, Blair's verbatim notes indicate that this virus could in fact potentially lie dormant in the bodies of already departed cadavers that were currently being stored in the aforementioned cold storage area of Outpost 31. And it wouldn't take long before another victim would join the bodies in cold storage, the first human casualty of the rumored infection and murders of the Outpost 31 crew. A combination of McCrady's audio logs as well as time of death indicators reveal that the first crew member to be killed at this outpost is none other than George Bennings. While the charred remains of his body were found partially buried on site, these recordings show that the team believed Bennings to have been fatally infected by this parasitic disease, and that it was potentially McCrady himself who killed Bennings when he started to present viral symptoms of infection. Now, what these symptoms actually were in terms of how they presented is not actually recorded in any of these documents, which also casts a suspicious light on whether or not McCrady just made up these reports entirely, no doubt to cover up his own murders at the outpost. It would be shortly after this first death that the communications to Outpost 31 would cease completely, which triggered the eventual investigation of responding concerned authorities in the subsequent days. Upon investigating, these authorities confirmed that not only were radio communications completely destroyed, but any and all potential methods of escape, be it airborne or otherwise, were also sabotaged, reportedly at the hands of the now manic biologist Blair. McCrady's notes describe a crazed altercation with Blair in which, after destroying the aforementioned equipment, he then attacked members of Outpost 31's crew. Now, medical experts suggest that this may have actually been a form of cabin fever-like psychosis, no doubt heightened by the events over the last 24 hours. Now, this was a theme that would be a common explanation for the following events at the site. Now, records show that Blair is isolated by the crew in a nearby toolshed, the same location that he was presumed to have been killed when explosions would later ravage the facility. Now, at this point, recovered documents reveal that tensions among the crew at Outpost 31 are at an understandably all-time high. And with the nature of the infectious virus at hand, trust seems to be a major issue here. Now, McCrady's own audio logs indicate that the crew isn't sure who to trust regarding who may be infected by this parasitic virus, which potentially seems to alter the host both physically and mentally. Due to the recent sabotage on site, which included blood samples of the various crew members that may have actually exonerated them from infection, command of the station is handed over to none other than R.J. McCready himself. So let's pause here to talk about the other theories of the killings at the Outpost. While we've discussed the potential of a parasitic virus of some sort, there are also very down-to-earth theories that lend themselves to a simple fact. Murders took place at this Antarctic research facility, and they were committed by a human being. And that human being was none other than R.J. McCready himself. The numerous killings that we'll cover can mostly be attributed to McCready, and if you remove the unconfirmed reports of the medical infection across the outpost, the simple fact is that this was an isolated group of individuals experiencing increased paranoia due to external circumstances that were largely out of their control. It's really not much of a stretch to think that this kind of pressure could lead to any number of individuals or persons to commit any number of supposed crimes, as such including that of murder. All of the individuals present at the time of this isolation presented mistrust and aggression, and when you throw in the potential life-threatening perception of some sort of infection, it may have in fact pushed R.J. McCready to do something outside of his usual actions, including that of murdering his fellow crew. And given the fact that the responding investigators of the outbreak at Outpost 31 have mostly inconclusive findings, it's really quite frankly up in the air on whether or not McCready simply snapped. Now, responding authorities also discovered the body of assistant biologist Fuchs outside the compound. Coroner reports indicates that Fuchs's ultimate cause of death is unclear, but due to the state of the body, namely that it was discovered extensively burned, similar to most of the bodies at Outpost 31, it's theorized by some that it may have actually been an attempt to hide forensic evidence at the hands of murder suspect R.J. McCready. The next string of deaths at this U.S. outpost are a bit of a confusing mess, and timelines provided by authorities are not always 100% clear. While securing the mess hall of the facility, investigators discover a mass of bodies in various states of decay, and as the recovery of the dead proceeds, the condition of the bodies themselves and the causes of death therein prove to be disturbingly strange. The bodies of Handler Clark and Dr. Copper, both of whom were bound and wrapped in blankets, are found in the rear of the room. Now, initial investigation indicates that Clark was killed by a single gunshot wound to the head, likely from medium range. Ballistics are able to match the bullet from Clark's skull with that of the weapon registered to Security Officer Gary, though due to the fact that the weapon was actually not recovered from the scene, it's unclear who fired the shot and ultimately who committed this murder. Again, it's theorized that it was likely R.J. McCready, as all the other victims are attributed to McCready himself. Dr. Copper's body was found to have suffered from the complete amputation of his arms below the elbow. An autopsy reveals that he likely died from extreme blood loss as a result. Now, what this amputation was from is ultimately unclear and could never actually be proven by any kind of medical investigation. The amputated arms themselves were never actually recovered on site. The next victim is none other than Communications Officer Windows, who was found in the same mess hall in a similar state to the other bodies on the premises, and that his body itself was badly burned. While his cause of death is unclear, there is massive trauma to his head, including extensive lacerations and multiple skull fractures. It's suggested that Windows may have been attacked at some point, likely by suspect R.J. McCready, and that his body was again burned to conceal method of execution and potential DNA evidence that would link back to R.J. McCready himself. Now, at this point of the investigation, authorities have determined that the burnings were typically the result of the use of a flamethrower, as multiple such weapons were recovered from the site itself and found to have been used very recently, confirmed by lack of fuel in the tanks. Now, while the body of the next victim, who was Assistant Mechanic Palmer, was not actually fully recovered, his blood samples were found to have been present in the mess hall, including, strangely, on the ceiling of the room. His clothing and tissue samples were also discovered outside, near the site of an apparent explosion, which was theorized as yet another potential attempt at concealing evidence. Additionally, investigators also find the mutilated remains of geologist Norris in an adjacent medical wing, where it appears that he might have also been killed via flamethrower attack. Now, his head was located nearby, seemingly removed, but coroners are unsure if this decapitation occurred naturally, happening post-mortem, as the result of the awkward positioning of his body, combined with the extensive tissue damage from the flame unit, may have caused his head to, quite disturbingly, fall off. The bodies of the remaining members of the Outpost 31 crew, Childs, Blair, Knowles, and Gary, could not actually be located or recovered by investigators. Due to the fact that biologist Blair had previously been locked and secured in the toolshed outside, which was destroyed in the ensuing explosions on the base, he was presumed to have been killed in the blast. While the fates of Knowles, Gary, and Childs also remain a mystery, it's quite possible, and often theorized, that their bodies were lost to the explosions at the facility, or that they may have actually been in the tunnels beneath the compound when they collapsed in the blast. Now, these series of maintenance tunnels were used as a means to power the facility. And while the claims can't be actually confirmed, it's a fact that somebody would have had to place the explosive charges in these tunnels themselves. So it's not really unreasonable to think that it may have been the entire surviving crew at this time. The explosions in the tunnels and across the base itself would have been so severe that all 3 individuals were likely killed. Now, lastly, we come to the primary suspect in the case, R.J. McCready, whose fate, like many of the other crew members of Outpost 31, remains shrouded in mystery. His body could not be located, though it's heavily assumed that if he did survive the explosions at the base, he likely would have succumbed to the sub-zero temperatures overnight. And due to the vastness of the Arctic tundra, and the fact that a strong winter storm had blown in, blanketing much of the area and even more snow, the odds of McCready's body being recovered at some point are pretty much slim to none. Now, from the combination of records recovered at the outpost and McCready's own voice recordings, investigators' prime theory in the case is that this helicopter pilot may have suffered from a paranoid cabin fever, and as such experienced a rapid mental decline, possibly exacerbated by the grim discovery at the nearby Norwegian Camp Thule. Reports filed indicate that McCready may have killed his fellow crew members at the base and concocted this supposed viral outbreak as a means to cover up his own crimes, and to possibly support his means of body disposal by that of burning, should he eventually have been rescued or discovered. It's quite possible as well that when the crew realized what was happening, they might have actually set these various explosive charges across the base in an attempt to secure themselves or maybe even fight back against their assailant, a plan that obviously backfired terribly. Others suggest that McCready himself may have set the explosives in a final attempt to cover up all evidence that would lead back to him as the killer in the case. Now, it's important to note here that this is simply just the theory of primary investigators, and we can't cover the case of the outbreak at Outpost 31 without also touching on the more popular conspiracy theory. It's also quite possible that this viral infection was indeed real. And whether the origins of the virus were biological, perhaps picked up from something the Norwegian crew found buried in the ice and inadvertently transferred to the US Outpost crew, or whether it was, yes, extraterrestrial as theorized by Norwegian video evidence and biologist Blair's own medical journals, the fact is there is evidence present at the US Outpost 31 that supports this virus being a real medical event. But because the details surrounding the symptoms or the indicators of said virus are ultimately unclear, and the majority of physical evidence was destroyed at the facility, other than the potential genetic anomalies of some of the corpses discovered at Outpost 31, there's simply not enough evidence to make it a conclusive theory. Now, as always with these more obscure cases, the decision of what to believe is ultimately up to you. Do you believe the tragedy at Outpost 31 was simply the result of a mentally unstable individual? Or was it a viral outbreak of unknown origin, possibly resulting in the deaths of the crew, as they were either infected or attempted to contain the disease? Or could the conspiracies actually be true, and can the outbreak at Outpost 31 be instead attributed to some sort of extraterrestrial thing, covered up by a shoddy investigation and government interference? We may never get concrete answers, but perhaps that's part of the allure of the now famous and bizarre case that took place in 1982 Antarctica at US Outpost 31. Thanks for listening to our true crime spin on The Thing. This was new territory, as it's our first sci-fi horror covered on the podcast. The Thing is an all-time classic and one of my personal favorite movies of all time, both horror and otherwise. It's so wild to me that when it first came out, it was considered a commercial and a critical failure, with some critics even writing it off as a gross-out geek horror for teenagers. And that's an actual quote, man. It would eventually gain a cult status and become revered in the subsequent years, not only for the performances, but also the unbelievable practical effects that still look incredible over 40 years later. And even though we don't have a huge backstory to the characters characters, they're all just so believable in the crazy situation they find themselves in, which is aided by the strong performances from the entire cast. If you haven't seen this movie, I highly recommend you do so immediately. Just make sure it's the 1982 version from John Carpenter and not the 2011 prequel that strangely has the exact same title. Like literally, it's also called The Thing. Like just The Thing, no subtitle or anything. It's such a bizarre choice. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, follow, like, comment, all that fun stuff. Next week, we'll be tackling another genre classic involving a certain haunted hotel. Trust me, you don't want to overlook that episode. As always, that'll be out next Tuesday, but until then, I'm your host, Evan Taggart, and this has been Inside the Mask.